No one in Gainesville knew it yet, but the quiet summer of 1990 was sitting on top of a storm. It was the kind of storm that didn't show up in the sky. It hid in the shadows, waited in the corners, and walked right past people who had no idea they were looking at danger. If someone had pressed pause on the whole city and whispered, 3 days from now, nothing will feel safe again, no one would have believed it. Because everything seemed fine. Students filled the sidewalks with backpacks and plans. Parents unloaded cars in parking lots. The new semester at the University of Florida was only days away, and people talked about roommates, classes, and football season. When you looked around, all you saw were young faces, bright colors, the energy of a fresh start. Gainesville felt like a place where bad things didn't last long. The sun seemed to shine stronger there. On warm nights, people sat outside their apartments with pizza boxes open and music floating through the air. Doors stayed unlocked during the day. The neighborhoods around campus, especially places like Williamsburg Village, were full of students who believed they were safe simply because everyone else around them was their age too. There was nothing to suggest the city was steps away from becoming a headline across the country. At WFT News, student journalists worked on light stories, back-to-school features, campus parking, and new cafeteria menu. Reporters joked about how calm August always felt. The quiet before the storm, one of them said without thinking. No one knew how true those words would become. Meanwhile, Sonia Larson and Christina Powell were settling into their apartment at Williamsburg Village. They were excited. They were young. They talked about decorating, about classes, about the future. That little apartment wasn't just a place to sleep. It was their first real taste of freedom. In another part of Gainesville, Manuel, Manny, Tabawada, and Tracy Poles were getting ready for the semester too. They had been close friends for years, and living together made sense. Manny was strong and kind. Tracy was smart, confident, always ready to take charge. If anything ever went wrong, Tracy was the type who didn't freeze, she moved. And just a short distance away lived 18-year-old Krista Hoyt. She worked part-time at the sheriff's office, joked with coworkers, and kept a tight schedule. She was the kind of student who planned every hour of her day. Her future looked like a straight path forward. But the thing about danger is that it doesn't care how bright someone else's life looks. It doesn't care about plans or promise. It doesn't even care if a whole city believes it's safe. Danger arrives when people aren't looking for it. And in Gainesville, no one was. The nights were warm, the air was still, and the sounds of cicadas filled the gaps between laughter and late-night conversations. Apartment lights turned off one by one. Doors clicked shut. Windows were cracked open for the breeze. Students slept lightly, thinking about schedules and textbooks, not realizing that someone else was awake, someone watching, someone choosing. At this point, the people of Gainesville lived in a kind of bubble. They went to the grocery store at midnight without thinking twice. They walked between parking lots and apartments with headphones on. Everyone trusted the familiar streets, and the city felt too small and friendly to imagine a stranger hiding in the dark. It was this perfect calm that made what came next so shocking. Inside WFT, the newsroom slowed down as the night shift prepared to sign off. On the police scanner, officers talked about normal things, traffic stops, noise complaints, a lost dog. Nothing unusual. When the reporters waved goodnight and stepped outside, the warm air wrapped around them like a blanket. Gainesville always felt gentle after dark. If anyone passing by had stopped and really listened, they might have felt something in the stillness. Something off. Something waiting. But no one did. Down at Williamsburg Village, Sonia and Christina talked softly as they got ready for bed. Their apartment looked cozy, like two young women had worked hard to make it feel like home. Books stacked on the counter. Clothes folded on the bed. Lights turned off one by one until only the soft glow from the streetlights filtered through the blinds. Across town, Manny and Tracy also settled in. The new semester was close, and they were thinking about the usual things: classes, friends, routines. Their apartment felt familiar, comfortable, and safe. Krista Hoyt walked into her home later that evening, tired from work, but in her usual good spirits. She would have no reason to think a quiet night could hide a terrible secret. Gainesville breathed slow and easy, unaware that a single person was moving in the shadows, watching the calm world like someone choosing which window light would blink out next. If you stood above the city that night, looking down on the apartments, the campus, the streets, it would have looked peaceful, almost peaceful enough to hide the truth pressing in from the edges. Something terrible was about to happen. Something that would make students lock their doors, make parents drive hundreds of miles overnight, make the city feel like every corner hid a pair of eyes. But none of that had happened yet. For now, Gainesville slept, and the storm kept moving closer. The first sign that something was wrong in Gainesville came quietly, almost gently, the way a single drop of rain hints at a coming storm. On the morning of August 24th, 1990, the sun rose as usual over Williamsburg Village. It looked like an ordinary day. Students walked to class. Cars hummed down the streets. But inside one apartment, something was terribly out of place. When Sonia Larson didn't answer her phone, friends assumed she was busy. When Christina Powell didn't pick up either, people thought maybe the two freshmen were still getting settled. It wasn't strange for students to be hard to reach during the first week of school. Everyone was running around with lists, meeting new people, figuring out their routines. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, worry began to spread. Two friends of the girls decided to stop by the apartment to check in. They walked up the stairs, knocked, waited, and listened. Nothing. The silence was heavy, too heavy. When the door was finally opened with the help of someone from the building, that quiet turned into something colder. No one shouted. No one screamed. But everyone who stepped inside felt a change in the air, like the room itself was telling them something terrible had happened. A call went out to police, and in minutes, the peace that Gainesville took for granted started to crumble. Word traveled quickly, the way bad news always does. Officers came and went. Neighbors whispered. The breeze carried rumors down the sidewalks. And just like that, the comfort of the new school year felt fragile. That night, fear began to settle in, but no one knew yet just how far it would spread. 2 days passed. People tried to return to normal life, but the city didn't feel the same. Students who had never locked their doors now checked them twice. Friends asked each other to walk in groups. Parents called more often. But even with the fear growing, no one imagined that the worst had not even happened yet. On August 27th, Gainesville woke up to another shock. This time, it was the apartment of Manuel Manny Tabawada and Tracy Poles. They were well-known, well-liked, and strong personalities. Tracy was the kind of person who stood up for others. Manny was big, athletic, and protective of his friends. If anybody could stop a stranger, it would be them. Yet that morning, their apartment was quiet too. Too quiet. When police entered, it didn't take long for them to understand that whatever had happened at Williamsburg Village was not an isolated tragedy. It was the work of the same person. Someone who watched people closely. Someone who planned. Someone who chose homes where young students lived. The officers didn't say everything out loud, but their eyes said enough. Gainesville wasn't dealing with a random crime. This was something far more frightening. What no one in Gainesville knew yet was that there was another victim linked to these days, Krista Hoyt, who had also been attacked during this terrifying period. She was young, responsible, full of promise, and her loss added even more heartbreak to a city already struggling to understand what was happening. By now, news crews had arrived. Helicopters hovered. Reporters stood on sidewalks with microphones, speaking in serious tones. Students peeked through curtains or stood in groups, unsure of what to do. People didn't walk alone anymore. People didn't leave windows open. Some packed bags and left town altogether. At WFD News, student journalists tried to make sense of it all. Phones rang nonstop. The newsroom, which days earlier had been calm and cheerful, now felt like the center of a storm. Everyone wanted answers, but police were careful with what they shared. They didn't want people to panic, but they also didn't want to pretend everything was fine. Even without details, everyone felt the same question burning through Gainesville. Who was doing this? Was it someone local? Someone passing through? Someone blending in with the crowds of students? The idea that a stranger could be watching any apartment at any time made every shadow feel darker. With every sunset, the fear grew. Police cars cruised slowly through neighborhoods. Officers knocked on doors and spoke to residents. Some apartments were inspected for signs of forced entry, and people were told to stay alert, lock their doors, and report anything suspicious. But the truth was simple. No one knew where the person would strike next, or if they already had. One story that spread through Gainesville during those days came from a survivor, Christina Powell, who had managed to live through an attack during the spree. She had been bound and threatened, but had survived the terrifying encounter. She didn't know who the attacker was. She didn't know why she was targeted. But her survival meant something important. The person responsible was not unstoppable. They made mistakes. They could be caught. Still, the details she shared, kept respectful for investigation, only confirmed what everyone feared. The attacker was prepared, confident, and dangerously unpredictable. Her experience added weight to the fear in the city. Students wondered, if someone could enter one apartment without being seen, could they enter others too? Evenings felt different now. Gainesville wasn't a loud place to begin with, but during those days, the silence felt unnatural. People double-checked their doors before bed. Some piled furniture against entrances. Many didn't sleep at all. Parents drove hundreds of miles overnight just to pick up their children. Parking lots filled with cars as students left the city. Apartment complexes hired security guards. Police set up hotlines and crime units worked around the clock. Gainesville no longer felt like a college town. It felt like a place under siege. And yet, the attacker remained invisible. He moved quietly, watched quietly, chose quietly. No one saw him. No one recognized him. He slipped between buildings like smoke, leaving fear behind him every time. By the end of the fourth day, the entire city was holding its breath. Students who once walked freely now moved in groups or stayed inside completely. Neighbors checked on each other constantly. People waited for news, for an arrest, for something, anything, that could return life to normal. But the truth was harsher. The nightmare had only just begun, and the city didn't yet know the face of the man who caused it. Before Gainesville even understood what was happening, the man responsible for the chaos was already disappearing into the woods, quiet, steady, like he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. But here's the part that shocks people the most. While an entire city stayed awake in fear, the killer was sleeping peacefully in a homemade camp less than 2 miles away. A camp no one expected. A camp almost no one found. A camp hidden so well that it blended into the trees like it was part of the forest itself. And that is exactly where this part begins. By August 28th, Gainesville felt like a city frozen in place. Police scanners buzzed. Residents moved like they were holding their breath. Helicopters traced slow circles above the trees. Every sound felt sharper. Every footstep, every door closing, every rustle from the bushes. Officers were now running on little sleep, working around the clock. More than 150 tips came in every day, but none pointed to a suspect. Everyone wanted to help, but fear clouded the truth. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some swore they saw a man lurking outside windows. Some said someone was following them from class. Some claimed a stranger was knocking on doors late at night. Most were false alarms, but the killer was absolutely still there. And he was watching. On a humid afternoon, 2 Alachua County deputies scanned a wooded area just outside Archer Road, the kind of place most people passed without noticing. It was dense with pine trees and palmettos, the ground uneven and soft. The air felt still, almost heavy. They weren't searching for a person. Not yet. They were looking for something simpler. A clue. Trash, rope, cigarette butts, an old footprint. Anything that might point them in a direction. But what they found was much more than a clue. One deputy spotted something odd near the base of a tree. Not garbage. Not a footprint. Something arranged on purpose. The area looked disturbed, like someone had camped there recently. There were small items on the ground. Carefully placed, not scattered. Bits of tape. A screwdriver. A makeshift bed of leaves and cloth. And strangest of all, audio equipment. Like someone had been recording or listening quietly from inside the woods. This wasn't kids hanging out. This was organized. This was intentional. And the way the items were arranged gave officers chills. Everything had a place. Everything had been cleaned. Whoever stayed there wasn't passing through. He lived there. One of them muttered the thought everyone was too scared to say. Whoever's doing this, he's right under our noses. When more officers arrived, they took in the scene piece by piece. The campsite was small, barely big enough for one person, but incredibly detailed. Almost professional. Hidden behind thick brush, invisible unless someone stood directly on top of it. There was a small fire pit, recently used. There were cans of food, empty but neatly stacked. There were makeshift tools carved from branches. There were scraps of clothing and tape that looked eerily similar to materials found at the crime scenes. But the most chilling thing of all, a tiny path, barely noticeable, leading deeper into the forest. A path someone had walked many times. Police followed it slowly, unsure of what they'd find. Maybe another campsite. Maybe a lookout spot. Maybe something worse. But halfway down the trail, one deputy suddenly stopped. The hair on his arms stood up. There was a bag hidden behind a fallen log. A bag filled with items they recognized. Items connected to the victims. That was the moment the mood shifted. The air felt heavier. Officers didn't speak. They didn't need to. This wasn't just a campsite. This was the killer's home base. Everything they found told the same story. The killer wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a mastermind criminal. He was a man living in the woods like he wanted to disappear. But the part that made everyone uneasy was the timing. Because just hours before police arrived, the camp was still warm. The logs around the fire were soft with heat. The ground looked freshly disturbed. Food had been opened recently. Whoever lived there had left fast, too fast. And he left behind something else. A footprint in soft mud. Large, deep, precise. Police cast it in plaster, but the rain later washed the area clean. If the deputies had shown up even 1 hour later, the footprint would have been gone forever. It almost felt like the killer knew they were coming. But that wasn't the only clue he left. Inside the camp, officers found a small logbook. Nothing with names, nothing obvious. But certain symbols matched patterns investigators had already noticed in the timing and planning of the attacks. It was the first solid link tying the woods to the crimes. And for the first time, detectives had hope. They had something real, something physical, something the killer didn't expect them to find. But while they searched the forest for more evidence, the suspect was already long gone, slipping quietly through back roads, blending into traffic, moving like he had no past and needed no future. He vanished so completely that for a moment, police wondered if he'd ever been there at all. That night, as investigators reviewed what they found, one detective said a name that had only recently shown up in the background of the case. A man whose behavior had raised concerns at a nearby campsite days earlier. A drifter, a loner, someone with a violent past. A man named Danny Rolling. No one in the room reacted at first. The name meant nothing. Just another person to check. Another drifter passing through Florida. But they didn't know yet that this name would soon break the case open. And they didn't know that while they sat discussing him, Rolling was already hundreds of miles away, preparing to do something that would finally expose him to the world. Gainesville wasn't done with him, and neither was Florida. Before investigators even said his name out loud, the man who cast a shadow over Gainesville had already made his next mistake. Not a giant mistake, not something flashy, just a tiny slip, one that didn't look important at first. But that slip would eventually reveal the truth. This chapter begins with something almost unbelievable. The killer who terrified an entire Florida college town was caught by accident. Not for murder, not for stalking, not for anything connected to Gainesville. He was arrested for something small, something that looked ordinary, something that didn't raise alarms. And yet it became the thread that unraveled everything. On the afternoon of September 7th, 1990, less than 2 weeks after the murders, police in Ocala, Florida found themselves investigating a robbery at a grocery store. The suspect had run into the woods afterward, disappearing like he knew the terrain well. Deputies searched the area. They listened for footsteps. They scanned bushes for movement. And then they spotted a man lying in a wooded patch nearby, pretending to sleep as if nothing had ever happened. He gave a name that wasn't his. He acted calm, almost polite. But something felt off. They arrested him. He was quiet during processing. Cooperative. Not angry, not anxious. Almost too calm for someone caught running from a crime. His real name eventually surfaced. Danny Harold Rolling. At the time, no one in Ocala knew that name meant anything. He was just another drifter with a record of small crimes. Nothing unusual. Nothing screaming danger. They booked him, stored his belongings, logged his clothing, placed him in jail. They had no idea they had just captured the most wanted man in Florida. Back in Gainesville, investigators combed through the mysterious forest campsite found earlier. Everything was bagged, labeled, and sent to labs. They didn't yet know who lived there or how close he'd been to them during the search. Days passed. Then a tech in the crime lab called detectives with something simple. Some items have fingerprints. This wasn't shocking. People leave prints everywhere. But these prints weren't random. They were clear enough to compare. So lab workers ran them through national records, the same way airports scan boarding passes. A match popped up. It wasn't a perfect match yet, just a possible one. But the name grabbed attention: Danny Rolling. A detective remembered the name from a note someone had made about a disturbance earlier that month. Another detective remembered hearing it while reviewing tips. A third remembered checking jail logs and seeing Danny booked in Marion County. Separate pieces suddenly pointed in the same direction. This was the moment when the case, for the first time, started making sense. While detectives studied Rolling's background, something else clicked. A crime analyst noticed Rolling had a troubling history in Louisiana: break-ins, stalking, and a violent attack on his own father. Old reports showed he grew up in a home full of rage and fear. Court documents painted a painful picture of a boy who never felt safe, and a man who carried that damage with him wherever he went. But there was another detail, one that made detectives lean forward in their chairs. Around the same time Rolling left Louisiana, a set of grisly crimes had happened in Shreveport. They weren't identical to Gainesville's cases, but there were similarities, too many to ignore. So investigators contacted police in Louisiana. Louisiana sent back case files. Gainesville detectives opened them slowly and froze. The similarities were chilling. A pattern was forming. A pattern only one man seemed to fit. A man sitting quietly in a jail cell, just 40 miles from Gainesville. With permission, detectives headed to Marion County Jail to examine Rolling's stored belongings, the same items taken from him the day he was arrested for the grocery store robbery. The officers unlocked the storage area and pulled the boxes forward. What they found inside felt like electricity running through the room. Clothing that looked like items worn by the suspect described in Gainesville. Tools that matched marks left at crime scenes. A tape recorder filled with strange, emotional messages, Rolling talking about his life, his pain, his anger, and sometimes referring to himself with different names, like he was playing roles in his own story. Each box told a piece of the puzzle. But the turning point came when they compared a small knife found with Rolling's belongings to marks found at the victims' homes. The patterns aligned. Slowly, carefully, piece by piece, the picture began to form. This was no longer guesswork, not a hunch, not a coincidence. The evidence pointed to one person, and one person only. Danny Rolling was their suspect. Investigators approached Rolling in jail. They asked him about Gainesville. They asked where he had been in late August. They asked if he knew anything about the murders. Rolling didn't admit anything, but he didn't deny it either. He started talking about life, fate, God, darkness, music, his childhood, anything except the questions he was asked. He rambled like he was trying to distract himself from the truth, or maybe from the weight of what he'd done. Detectives walked out of the room convinced of two things. He wasn't innocent, and he wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. As more evidence poured in, the chain connecting Rolling to Gainesville grew stronger and stronger. Prints, tools, belongings, patterns, timing, his campsite, his recordings, his arrest just days after the murders. And then the biggest moment of the investigation arrived, the point where detectives stopped wondering and finally knew. DNA results matched. It was official. It was final. It was irrefutable. Danny Rolling was the Gainesville killer. The man who hid in the woods. The man who frightened a whole city. The man who slipped away until he didn't. Florida had its monster, but the world still didn't know why he did it. That question would soon lead investigators deep into Rolling's past, into a childhood full of fear, into a life twisted long before Gainesville ever knew his name. Before the trials, before the lawyers, before the final judgment, investigators needed to understand the one thing everyone was asking. Why? Why Gainesville? Why the cruelty? Why Danny Rolling? This part begins with a truth that stunned many. Danny Rolling had been broken long before he ever reached Florida. His crimes didn't come from thin air. They came from a lifetime of pain, fear, failure, and rage, all mixing into something that should have been stopped, but never was. And his past would soon become a centerpiece of the courtroom. Danny Rolling was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, in 1954. From the outside, the house looked normal: small yard, simple rooms, a quiet neighborhood. Inside, everything was different. His father, James Rolling, worked as a police officer, but at home he was strict, cold, and sometimes cruel. Some court documents later showed a pattern. The father shouted often, punished harshly, and rarely showed warmth. Danny's mother, Claudia, tried to comfort her children, but she struggled with her own mental health and felt trapped inside the home. Danny saw both of his parents as people who loved him and hurt him at the same time. As he got older, that confusion hardened into something heavier. He never learned how to feel safe. He never learned how to calm himself down. He never learned what healthy love looked like. By the time Danny was a teenager, he had begun drifting away from school, away from family, away from everything normal. He stole. He ran away. He slept in parks. He turned up days later acting like nothing happened. His family tried at times to bring him back on track, but nothing held for long. There was always something dark inside him, something that grew louder every year. As an adult, Rowling bounced from job to job. He washed dishes, worked in restaurants, spent nights at campgrounds and cheap motels. He never stayed anywhere long. Whenever trouble came close, he disappeared before people could ask questions. He married young, hoping family life would fix him. It didn't. He later had a daughter, and for a moment, it seemed like he might settle down. But he couldn't escape old habits. He drifted, stole, lied, and acted unpredictable. His wife left him. His daughter lost contact. His life fell apart. And Rowling reacted the only way he knew. He ran. Again and again. His criminal record grew slowly. Burglary, theft, break-ins. Most weren't violent. Most looked like the work of someone desperate, homeless, or lost. But deep down, Rowling was not just lost. He was unstable. He was angry. He was searching for something to blame. Investigators later believed that Rowling didn't just want to escape his past, he wanted to destroy it. And that desire eventually pushed him toward darker crimes. Before Gainesville, there was Shreveport. Investigators found records of a terrifying crime in November 1989 involving a family inside their home. No graphic details were ever needed to see that the attack was deeply violent and planned. For months, no solid suspect was found. But when Gainesville police shared their evidence with Louisiana authorities, similarities appeared. Timing, style, behavior, even items left behind. The Shreveport case eventually became one of the strongest clues pointing to Rowling long before his confession. And not just in the method, but in the motive. Because inside the Shreveport house was something that opened investigators' eyes: food left behind, clothing disturbed, signs of someone watching the family beforehand. It was the first real sign that Rowling didn't pick his victims randomly. He watched. He studied. He followed patterns. And Gainesville was next. Court records from Louisiana described one moment that changed Rowling's life forever. In May 1990, just 3 months before Gainesville, the police were called to Rowling's parents' home. An argument had turned into a fight. The fight turned into a shootout. Danny's father was shot in the face and stomach, but survived. Rowling fled the state. That moment was considered by psychologists later as the emotional break point, the event that pushed him beyond the line. The moment when he disconnected from everyone and everything he had ever known. One investigator described it like this: after that day, Danny Rowling stopped running from his past and ran toward destruction. When Rowling finally appeared in a Florida courtroom in the early 1990s, the defense team studied his past to understand his mind. Psychologists interviewed him. They reviewed childhood reports, police files, medical papers, and recordings Rowling had made while hiding in the woods. Those tapes were strange, emotional, and sometimes dramatic, like he was talking to himself, telling stories about his pain, about evil, about God, and about a version of himself he called Gemini. Some experts believed Rowling created that identity as a way to escape responsibility. Others believed it was a performance, Rowling trying to make his crimes seem bigger, darker, or more mysterious than they were. But prosecutors stayed focused on one fact: whatever happened in his mind, he had made choices. He had planned. He had prepared. He had taken lives on purpose. There was no voice in his head strong enough to erase that. Rowling's trial revealed everything investigators had pieced together: his violent childhood, his mental breakdowns, his criminal past, his escape from Louisiana, his hidden life in the Florida woods, his recordings, his belongings, his silent interviews, his attempt to become, in his own twisted mind, some kind of feared outlaw. The most sobering part was how ordinary many of his days looked. He shopped for groceries. He played guitar. He walked through parks. He talked politely to people who had no idea who he really was. It showed that true danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks quiet. Sometimes it looks harmless. Sometimes it hides in the trees next to a college campus. Even after hours of testimony, even after psychologists explained their theories, even after Rowling himself spoke about his past, one question remained unanswered: why Gainesville? Rowling never gave a clear reason. No personal connection. No plan written down. No specific motive. The closest answer came from his own words: I lost myself. I let the darkness take me. But excuses did not matter. Not to the victims' families. Not to the investigators. not to the people of Florida. The truth was simple. Rolling's past shaped him. His choices defined him. And now the justice system would decide his future. Before the courtroom filled, before the cameras were rolled in, before Florida heard the truth from the killer himself, Danny Rolling made a choice nobody expected. He decided to talk. Not to bargain. Not to delay. Not to beg. He talked because he knew the evidence had caught up to him. He talked because running was finally over. And in the end, he talked because the story he carried inside him had nowhere else to go. This chapter begins with a moment that left the entire courtroom silent. Danny Rolling stood up and said he was guilty. No trial. No long battle between lawyers. No dramatic surprises. Just a simple, flat admission. But the story didn't end there. Not even close. It was February 15th, 1994. Courtroom spectators expected a normal pretrial hearing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing final. Some family members didn't even attend because they assumed it would be routine legal talk. Instead, Rolling's attorney stood and said quietly, "Your Honor, my client wishes to plead guilty." People gasped. Reporters scrambled for pens. Parents of the victims froze in disbelief. The judge asked the question out loud for the record. "How do you plead?" Rolling answered with a calm voice. "Guilty." One word. One breath. But it changed everything. For the families, it meant they would not have to sit through a long trial filled with painful details. It meant they didn't have to hear defense lawyers argue about Rolling's childhood, or doctors debate his mental health, or psychologists try to explain his motives. But the judge still needed to decide the punishment. And for that, both sides were allowed to present the full story. The sentencing phase began. Prosecutors moved carefully and respectfully. They did not use graphic language. They focused on facts, timelines, forensic evidence, and Rolling's planning. They showed items taken from the forest campsite, tools and weapons linked by lab tests, DNA results, footprints, Rolling's taped messages, patterns from Shreveport to Florida, evidence recovered after his arrest in Ocala. They showed that Rolling didn't act impulsively. He had prepared. He had studied his surroundings. He had chosen times and locations to avoid detection. The picture was clear. He knew exactly what he was doing. The state also called investigators who described their search, their fear of copycats, the enormous effort required to protect Gainesville's students, and the moment the evidence finally pointed to Rolling. They spoke professionally, not emotionally. They respected the victims and their families. They avoided unnecessary detail. But one message was unmistakable. This was a man who could not be allowed to hurt anyone ever again. Rolling's attorneys did something very different. They didn't claim he was innocent. They didn't deny the evidence. They didn't argue that someone else committed the crimes. Instead, they focused on his past, his trauma, his abusive home, his mental health issues, and the emotional collapse he suffered after shooting his own father. Experts explained that Rolling lived in a constant state of fear as a child, that he grew up believing violence and anger were normal, that he struggled with personality disorders, depression, and severe emotional instability. They presented medical records. They showed old photos. They read statements from family members. They described Rolling as a broken man who never received help. None of this was meant to excuse him. It was meant to explain him. The defense hoped the judge would choose life in prison over death. But the courtroom still felt the weight of what he had done. The victims' families sat quietly, listening with courage most people will never fully understand. During sentencing, Rolling did something unexpected again. He stood and apologized, not in a dramatic or emotional way, but in a simple, tired voice. He spoke about his childhood. He spoke about his pain. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He also sang a hymn he had written. Something he said helped him calm his mind. It surprised everyone. The courtroom didn't know whether to be confused, angry, or numb. But through it all, one thing became clear. Danny Rolling understood what was coming. After days of testimony, arguments, and emotional statements from family members, the judge made the final decision. The guilty plea stood. The evidence was overwhelming. The weight of the crimes was immense. The sentence was death. The courtroom stayed silent for several long seconds. No cheers. No loud reactions. Just a quiet understanding that justice had spoken. Families held each other. Investigators finally breathed. Reporters sent updates to newsrooms across the country. The Gainesville Ripper case was officially closed. But the story still had one more chapter. Rolling lived on death row for more than a decade. He gave a few interviews, wrote songs and poems, and continued to talk about his painful childhood. He sometimes referred to different versions of himself, the way he had in the woods on his tapes. Some people believed he wanted attention. Some believed he wanted to shape his own legacy. Some believed he simply needed someone to listen. But the families and the investigators didn't look back. They didn't let his stories distract them from the truth. They moved forward with strength and dignity. The case remained one of the most studied in criminal psychology classes. It taught police about better campus safety, quicker response coordination, and how to handle widespread fear during an ongoing investigation. Gainesville changed after 1990. Florida changed. Campuses across the country changed. On October 25, 2006, at a prison in Stark, Florida, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection. Family members of the victims were present. Rolling's final statement mentioned faith, forgiveness, and peace. He did not address the victims directly. He did not explain his motives. And then it was over. A chapter of Florida history ended quietly. The fear Rolling caused had ended long ago. But the memory of the victims and the strength of their families remained. He smirked when he said it, like he'd been waiting his whole life to brag. When investigators finally confronted Danny Rolling with the mountain of evidence, DNA, fibers, shoe prints, the campsite, they expected a fight. They expected denial, shouting, some twisted attempt to preserve innocence. But Rolling didn't resist. He leaned back, folded his arms, and smiled. It wasn't relief. It was pride. And that was the moment detectives understood. They weren't dealing with a confused drifter. They were dealing with a man who knew exactly what he had done. The confession that froze the room. By the time the trial arrived, the courtroom was packed. National media, locals, students, survivors. Everyone wanted to see the face of the monster who had terrorized Gainesville for 4 blood-soaked August days. Rolling entered calmly, almost casually. Then he stunned the room. Without warning, Rolling instructed his attorney to stand down. He would confess. As the words left his mouth, "I committed the murders." Audible gasps rippled through the gallery. Parents of victims broke down. Reporters scrambled. Even the judge appeared shaken. Rolling looked at no one. He simply stared straight ahead, as if reading a script he had rehearsed for years. The sentencing phase turned into something unforgettable. Victim after victim's family stood, walked to the podium, and stared directly into the eyes of the man who destroyed their lives. Some cried. Some trembled with rage. Some whispered prayers. But one father's words brought the courtroom to absolute silence. "You didn't just kill my daughter. You killed the future she never got to live." Rolling didn't blink. Not once. On the day of his execution, Rolling requested a microphone and delivered a bizarre, haunting religious song he had written in prison. A final show. A last performance. One more unsettling glimpse into a man who blurred the line between criminal and performer. Witnesses later said it felt like the room itself held its breath, because no one could understand how a man could cause so much pain and still smile as the curtain finally closed. At 6:13 p.m., Danny Rolling was pronounced dead, but the psychological scars he carved into Gainesville, those remain. The Gainesville Ripper changed Florida forever. He changed the way students lived. He changed the way people locked doors. He changed the way an entire state thought about safety. And even decades later, one question still lingers. Was Danny Rolling born a monster? Or did Florida create one? If you made it to the end, you're exactly the kind of person we make these documentaries for. If you want more real Florida nightmares, more cases that keep you up at night, and more deep-dive true crime stories that no other channel tells, backhand index pointing right, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't wait. New episodes are coming, and you do not want to miss the next one. And tell us in the comments, do you think Rolling was born evil or made evil? We will be reading every single one.